everyone. My name's Jason Gould. I'm a partner with the law firm of Faegre Drinker, and Reith. I'm based out of our Washington, D.C. office, but as a firm, we have over 1,200 attorneys across 22 offices. For those of you who don't know Faegre Drinker, we're well known for our representation of annuity issuers and distributors, as well as trade associations in the annuity space. And for the depth of our knowledge of life insurance and annuity issues and the key issues affecting both the carriers and the advisors selling those products. We're delighted to be assisting David Novak and the team at Annuities Genius on various issues, and to have the opportunity to speak with you today about some key compliance issues facing advisors who are involved in the solicitation and sale of annuity products. So thanks for having us, David. My practice has been heavily focused on life and annuity issues for over 20 years, and I'm joined today by two of my partners with years of compliance know-how and experience as well. From our New York office, we have my colleague Bob Mancuso. Bob specializes in insurance regulatory and compliance matters, and particularly in the life and annuity space. And down here in Washington, D.C., like me, is my colleague Pat Hughes. Pat is a go-to resource and advocate for clients on basically every important legislative, regulatory, and policy matter impacting the life and annuity space, as well as other lines of insurance. We put together a real compact program for you today. I know Bob and Pat will touch upon things about which we could go into much more detail, but this initial webinar today is going to be short and high level in the interest of time. Today we'll be focusing on the NAIC's suitability and annuity transactions model regulation. And I guess before we dive into the content, Pat, could you give us maybe a very high level overview of what role the NAIC plays with respect to rulemaking?
Sure, happy to, and likewise happy to join the conversation today. So the National Association of Insurance Commissioners is just what it sounds like. It's a national organization that's made up of all of the insurance commissioners throughout the country, and including their most senior regulators that assist them. It is a national standard-setting body for insurance regulation. And what that means is they aren't really lawmakers like Congress or a state legislature or a regulatory agency, a state or federal regulatory agency, but instead they issue model regulations, model statutes that then need to be adopted by the states individually in order to have the force of law. So when developing those models, generally speaking, the commissioners are trying to work towards a consensus and a common understanding. To become a model, it has to be passed by a supermajority of the commissioners, and they go through a very long, involved process of going through every detail. So once it goes through the ringer, it may not have the force of law, but it's something that, if it impacts your business, needs to be paid attention to. When an issue receives an awful lot of attention at the NAIC, the track record for adoption is generally good, although it's not always 100%. Generally speaking, that regulation or that law is going to pick up some momentum. So for the best interest and suitability work, that's the focus of our conversation today. That work was actually driven by the Annuity Suitability Working Group. That's how the NAIC works. They divide up their work into specific subject matter work streams. They worked long and hard. There were a lot of in-person workshops. That's unusual. I think that shows the importance of the issue. And they were under an awful lot of pressure to produce something that was responsive to the general political direction and the general federal direction. So there was a sense as a general proposition that the standard of care, that the standards for an annuity sale were going to need to evolve. It wasn't quite clear exactly what they were going to evolve into, and that's what all that work was about at the NAIC over a number of months and years.
Right. So Bob, the model states that one of its purposes is to require producers to act in the best interest of the consumer when they're making a recommendation of an annuity. So that seems to raise two key questions. The first would be, what does it mean to make a recommendation?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Then, before we dive into that question, I guess the first recommendation that I'd like to make is that anyone who's selling annuities should read the NAIC model. Today's discussion, we'll only touch on some of the aspects of the model at a high level. And, while I suspect that the vast majority of the attendees here, that is the loyal users of Annuities Genius, have already read the model, I can't stress enough the importance of just giving that a read from start to finish. Now, that's not a recommendation governed by the NAIC model, of course. So what is? The NAIC model defines a recommendation to mean advice by a producer to an individual consumer that was intended to result or does result in a purchase, exchange, or replacement of an annuity in accordance with that advice. A recommendation explicitly does not include general communications to the public, generalized customer service or administrative support, general education, prospectuses, or generalized sales material. So this definition, and we start with the definition of a recommendation because it's really a key trigger for determining whether a producer is going to have a compliance obligation, with the model. And, one last point to make on the definition of a recommendation, I think producers have to be mindful of the language that talks about intended to result. This means that there can be a recommendation which would trigger best interest compliance, even if there's not ultimately a purchase, exchange, or replacement. So, in thinking about it, best interest compliance or meeting a best interest obligation, as a producer, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, is something that I'm doing a recommendation, within the meaning of that definition.
And so Bob, in light of that meaning of recommendation, how do producers go about making a recommendation that's in the best interest of a consumer?
Right. So, the NAIC model itself states that a producer has acted in the best interest of the consumer if they've satisfied 4 obligations, and we'll talk more about those in a second. But the first is the care obligation, the second is the disclosure obligation, the third is the conflict obligation, and the fourth is the documentation obligation. Now, there are many nuances to each of these 4 obligations, but at a high level, in some recent draft FAQs that have been circulated, it's been stated that in order to satisfy those 4 obligations, producers must do all of the following: know the consumer's financial situation, insurance needs, and financial objectives, understand the available recommendation options to the producer, have a reasonable basis to believe the recommended option effectively addresses the consumer's financial situation, insurance needs, and financial objectives, communicate the basis of the recommendation to the consumer, disclose the producer's role in the transaction, disclose the producer's compensation, and disclose any material conflicts of interest, and then finally document in writing any recommendation and the justification for such a recommendation. So again, that's at a very high level. How do you meet the best interest obligation? There's a number of nuances and a couple kind of points to highlight here in this high level discussion. The first, it's worth noting that the producer is required to make reasonable efforts to obtain the consumer's what's called profile information. So, again, this is going to be the information that will be used as the basis for the producer's, ultimate recommendation. The type of information that might be collected is defined in the model. So there's an extensive list of items that a producer may collect, but it's important to remember that list is not intended to be exhaustive. It's an including but not limited to. So, certainly, each consumer may be different, and certain aspects of that list, or others may be important information for a producer to collect. Also, on the care obligation, it's important really to note that the producer is only required to consider annuity products that he or she is authorized and licensed to sell, and not alternative products or strategies. So, this is something that should be very helpful to producers, but at the same time, it's really important for a producer to make sure that they understand which products they are actually authorized to sell. And, by way of example, if you're authorized to sell indexed annuities, but you generally don't, and, a consumer's, best interest might be served by an indexed annuity, that's the product you might be expected to recommend. So, you really need to know the product shelf you're authorized to sell. And again, I think that's especially true if you generally only sell, a smaller subset of what that product shelf looks like. The disclosure obligation, the second obligation, the model actually comes with a form at Appendix A that producers, make many of the required disclosures, that a producer needs to make throughout this best interest process. And, those are items like the producer's role and relationship with the consumer, whether the producer is one that, only sells annuities for one insurer as opposed to having an opportunity to sell for multiple insurers. And then another, key aspect is going to be how the producer is compensated. So that's one sort of disclosure that's, the group did a form that sort of tries to attack, many of those components, which I think will be helpful, and we'll look to see if states do include that as a form. But the other, and perhaps I think key disclosure is that prior to or at the time of the recommendation or the sale of the annuity, the producer has to have a reasonable basis to believe that the consumer has been informed of various features of the annuity, right? So the producer's got to be disclosing to a consumer, the particular annuity being recommended, what its features are, how it works, what the mechanics are. And, the point to note here is, the timing, right? So when does this need to happen? And the model says it's prior to or at the time of the recommendation. Now, one of the things I think producers have to be mindful of is, what's the situation? And the situation may dictate timing, especially when you're thinking about replacements, because, query whether you can actually make this product disclosure, at the time of the sale, right, as opposed to giving the consumer all the information that they need to sort out whether or not, a replacement is indeed the way to go. So, there is some flexibility, again, prior to or at the time of the recommendation, but I think you got to be thinking through, your situation with your consumer and what's at play in terms of when that disclosure or that, that explanation around the features of the annuity should be given. The conflict obligation, the third obligation, at a very, very high level, the producer cannot place the producer's or the insurer's financial interest ahead of the consumer's interest, ever. I think a hallmark of this model and of this, standard is, the consumer's interest is what matters, and that's a dead stop right there. So, producers and insurers, their financial interests can never come ahead of the consumers. The fourth obligation is the documentation obligation. And this one is really, really important because for producers, I mean, this is really your written record that you did everything correctly. So the model states that the producer must, at the time of the recommendation or sale, make a written record of any recommendation and the basis for that recommendation. So, notably, this may also include instances where, a consumer does not provide all of the profile information that may be requested. This would potentially include instances where, a consumer does not follow your recommendation. Documenting, again, the basis for your recommendation and anything else that, again, doesn't go the way that you might like, or that, just goes differently than what you're recommending. Documenting those instances, it's really required, but, also could become an important record for producers to have, down the road. So Jason, at a high level, those are the four, obligations to meet the best interest standards. And, the way that the model is built, it suggests that, if you meet, those four obligations, and, you put the consumer's interest ahead, you have complied with the best interest standard.
Right. And so
So, Pat, if there are producers out there today that are selling variable products, do they even need to worry about this NAIC model in light of Reg BI?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a question that the NEIC spent an awful lot of time discussing. There was a lot of interest in how the NEIC was going to approach that exact question, a so-called safe harbor, which did make its way into the Model Act. Although there's still some question marks around exactly how that's going to be interpreted and work in the real world. So I would start from the general proposition that a producer always is going to need to be conscious of, respectful of the perspective, the regulatory framework of that state commissioner that is under the jurisdiction of that activity. I think there's no world in which a blind eye could be turned to where the model is headed or how it's being enforced or how it's being regarded. I think that, from what we know of regulators, just on the basic sense of, good relations and, keeping on their good side, if for no other reason, to be conscious of that, to know where they're headed. Having said that, there is some good news for those selling variable annuities in terms of trying to avoid duplication, which is what I think industry was trying to avoid, that exact thing, where you're waking up every morning with two sets of playbooks governing the exact same basic activities. And so the first piece of good news is that it was the explicit intent of the NEIC to harmonize what it was doing with regulation best interest standard. That was a key motivator for the NEIC to get going and finish up a model. And I think regulators understood that heading in a fundamentally different direction, in other words, creating a completely different set of a regulatory framework, would create a big mess. And the regulators who were in charge of developing this new model at the state level were very conscious of that and focused on trying to find a way to avoid that outcome. I think the second piece of good news in the state model, as far as that avoiding duplication, is that much of the core framework is in fact closely modeled on regulation best interest. And there's very similar language on what the best interest standard means, and the sort of the four pillars of the basic regulatory framework that Bob went through. Those are replicated, not exactly, but they are the same basic framework is found in the state model. So they're trying to head in the right direction. But on top of all that, there is, in fact, an explicit safe harbor for comparable standards, for meeting comparable standards to the state model, and regulation best interest is explicitly referenced as being able to be a comparable standard. So we want to see how this safe harbor develops and is interpreted over time. There are some outstanding questions to the Annuity Suitability Working Group. They're still at it, and they've promised us some clarification in the state regulator view, but nevertheless, that does regulation best interest is set to provide that stepping off point for the sale of a variable annuity as far as what that standard of conduct is going to be.
Great, yeah, that's super helpful. So Bob, other than the best interest obligations, what else should producers be aware of in the revised model?
Yeah, I think there's, maybe four other aspects of the model that, we should mention in today's setting. And the first is that the four best interest obligations that we walked through earlier apply to, this is quoting from the model, every producer who has exercised material control or influence in the making of a recommendation and has received direct compensation as a result of that recommendation. And that's whether the producer has had any direct contact with the consumer or not. So, just let that sink in for a minute, right? If you're a producer that's being compensated on a sale, you may have to meet those best interest obligations, even if you've never, had a conversation with the consumer. And, I I think this provision, but maybe some more still to come in terms of, how that'll be interpreted and certainly with respect to how it'll be enforced. But, in conjunction with some earlier discussions, I mean, I think the intent certainly at a high level is to avoid a situation where you have, a multiple producer shop where the more senior producer does most of the communicating, most of the talking, gets compensated, but, isn't the one who's, going to sign their name on the dotted line. The best interest standard really, wants to cover, the important communications, the important, dialogue that happens with the consumer. So, on the one hand, this is really just maybe aimed at covering those who, who participate, and get paid. And, I think in some instances that may make some sense, but in other instances, I think it also has the opportunity to pick up, some conduct where maybe that's not really the case. But, if you do have a multiple producer setting, I think this is a provision of the model that you definitely want to be looking at and be thoughtful of. The second of the next issue to raise is the model has a training component, and the model says that a producer should not solicit the sale of an annuity product unless the producer has adequate knowledge of the product in order to make the recommendation of the annuity, and the producer has to be in compliance with the insurer standards for product training. Training is something that, I'd say we probably expect carriers to provide certainly the product-specific training, but producers need to know that there is a training requirement component of this model, and that is something that they're going to need to have completed, probably to sell, an insurer's product. So, be mindful of that training coming out, and, something that, may take a little bit of time and, may be necessary across, multiple carriers. So something that producers are going to have to be mindful of and have to accomplish. Third is, the model's got a section on document retention. And, at a high level, producers are going to need to maintain and then be able to make available, records of the information they collected from consumers, the disclosures they made to consumers, and certainly the information that they use in making, the recommendation. And, we talked earlier about the documentation obligation. And, this is another reason why the documentation obligation is so important, right? So, remember, as a licensee, a producer could be asked for this information by a state department of insurance, but, I think more routinely, because insurers have a supervision obligation under the model, you should be expecting, insurers that you're selling products for to be reaching out to you to check up on compliance, and, depending on the volume of activity that may be, more frequent, than others. But, having your documentation and then taking the next step of retaining it is something that, it's just a must, at the end of the day, because you're likely going to be asked to produce it. And, as we talked about earlier, that's really your record of what happened, and your demonstration for how you did things correctly. So that will be a really key component, I think, for sure coming out of the model. The last thing I would mention here is there are some exemptions for transactions, not having to having the model not apply to those transactions. So, for example, there's an exemption for contracts used to fund, ERISA-covered employee pension or welfare benefit plans, various types of internal revenue code plans established or maintained by employers, certain government or church plans, certain non-qualified deferred comp plans, and then, finally, structured settlement annuities. So, again, Jason, I would say that's another reason there why, I'd make my initial recommendation again, which is, if you haven't, please put your eyes on the model so that you take a look at what's included and what's not.
Yeah, absolutely. So Pat, now that the model's been passed by the NAIC, what happens next, and what might folks expect to see over the last few months of the year?
Sure. So, for all the focus that the NAIC has given on it and industry has given on it, to date, there's only 2 states that have adopted the the model in its substantially similar form, and that's Arizona and Iowa. Iowa didn't surprise anybody because they are a leader on annuity regulation and at the NEIC, and were one of the key leaders to the development of the model. So it didn't really surprise anybody that they were early out of the gate. At the most recent national meeting of the NEIC, several states went on record that they were poised to adopt the new model very shortly, and those states were Idaho, Ohio, Kentucky, and Rhode Island. There are a lot of other states that we would think would be very natural for them to gravitate towards the model quickly. Just it's a consistent with the political direction of the administration that they're working in, and so we expect to see those over time. So I think one of the reasons why it's been slow in gaining momentum is not because we're going to, there's any resistance to it. I think far from it. There's a commitment by the regulators to move in that direction. It, like, many things, the pandemic really changed the priorities and slowed down the ability of regulators to quickly implement significant new initiatives. And so obviously the pandemic is still a matter of public policy concern, but a lot of the regulatory issues early on that the states needed to deal with, I wouldn't say that they're behind them, but they've really already put in place a response mechanism. And so I think that I expect to see the states turn to trying to adopt the model with a little bit quicker momentum. The other thing I will add is that for many states, all the state needs to do is adopt the new model by regulation, and as opposed to a state statute through the state legislature. And that's a much easier process. And for one thing, the regulator doesn't have to worry about whether that state legislature is in session or not. So on account of that, I think we can expect to see an awful lot of activity between now and the end of the year and or into 2021, that this is going to start to pick up a little bit more focus. As far as the adoption of the reg, I guess one thing that is important to emphasize, since we've been discussing the model regulation at length, and rightly so, is that some states are going to go their own way. So New York already has a best interest framework. There's a lot of similar provisions. There's a lot of similar intent, and yet there are things that are different, that are different approaches. And California, by legislation, is poised to pick up on what New York has done and adopt framework. And there are several other states throughout the country that have been getting ahead of the model and have put forward their own framework. So while it's hoped that there's going to be a great deal of uniformity, it's never going to be 100%. And so any organization that is working in multiple states, is going to have to be conscious of that there's going to be always, to some extent, a little bit of a patchwork, that it's never going to be perfect uniformity. I'll add that one of the ways that the NEIC and state regulators are trying to attack the uniformity issue, to speak with as one voice as much as possible, is to do a set of FAQs, and that Bob referenced before. Those are very much underdeveloped for public comments by the Annuity Suitability Working Group. There are several important topics that there is no answer in there yet. One of them is the safe harbor that we talked about. One of them is enforcement. But on some other topics, the regulators have tried to go out of their way to give some early indications on a national level of what the regulatory intent is. And so I would say, to double down on Bob's point about absorbing this regulation, understanding what's in there, I would also add that the importance of anyone working in this area to continue to follow the activity of the NEIC and its Annuity Suitability Working Group, because that group and the NEIC in general are still having an impact on how this model is going to be interpreted and enforced on a uniform basis or on as much uniformity as possible throughout the country. So I think following that, those developments, continues to be something that is important to do.
Yeah, so that's great advice. Thanks again to David and Bob and Pat, and I want to thank everyone for watching today. It was a pleasure bringing this today. I know we needed to keep things short for the sake of time today, but I hope you found Bob and Pat's comments helpful. We'll be doing more of these going forward. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to either let David know or to reach out to us directly. I think you can find our contact information on the Annuities Genius website. We look forward to continuing our partnership with David and Annuities Genius and to providing additional webinars and other content for you all in the future. So have a great day, everyone, and thanks again, David.